Today's episode is brought to you by the Tax Defense Group. The team of professionals at the Tax Defense Group are passionate about helping taxpayers resolve their tax debt. Their services include basic tax preparation, tax audits, resolving large tax debts, and more. They actively represent taxpayers throughout the entire U.S. Call today at 800-850-7973 to get started. That number again is 800-850-7973, and you can visit them online at thetaxdefensegroup.com. We recently launched our website, ucaststudios.com, with articles about sports, special interest topics, and more. We have some cool stuff on our site. To read our content, please visit ucaststudios.com. Welcome to the Talk Spot. This is Marcus, and today I'm joined again by Aubrey de Grey. Aubrey's been on a few times, and definitely I'm thankful to have him on again. Thank you again, Aubrey, for coming on. And I guess one of the first questions I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about was, obviously you've worked so much with, just the concept of reversing aging and people potentially living longer than we have either right now and in the past. I was kind of wondering if you wouldn't mind giving a little bit of a historical overview of maybe, what the typical person's lifespan was, let's say, for the past 500 years or 1,000 years, or however long far back you want to go. And maybe kind of what kind of chronic conditions they might have been in, and kind of what the average person might have experienced, historically in their life when it came to just their standard of living and things like that.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure. Of course, there isn't such a thing as a typical person. So, centuries ago, before we had anything that could possibly be called the beginnings of modern medicine, we had a very, very high rate of mortality early in life. In fact, more than 1/3 of babies would die before the age of 1, even in the wealthiest countries in the world. And of course, there was lots of death in childbirth and in throughout the whole of life. So, different people had very different lifespans. But if you reached the age of, let's say, 30 or 40, even a few hundred years ago or even 1,000 years ago, you actually had a very reasonable chance of getting quite a lot further. Certainly some people made it to their 80s or 90s even, way back then. It's just that they were the exceptions, because in order to get there, you had to get lucky, in terms of avoiding death from infection. Really, the thing that changed was the invention of modern medicine in the 19th century, courtesy of people like Edward Jenner and Louis Pasteur and Ignaz Semmelweis, who discovered a few really elementary principles, such as, hygiene is a good idea, and, the idea of vaccines and antibiotics, very simple medicines, even, mosquito nets. The number of lives that have been saved this way is absolutely staggering. But when we say saving lives, what we mean is saving people from dying young. So this means that in the industrialized world, by, let's say, World War II, we had reached the point where hardly anybody was dying in infancy or in early life, and nearly everybody was getting to 60 or 70. Certainly 60. So then the question is, what happened since that time? Because, of course, once you've done that, you can't do it again. It's still happening, of course, in the developing world, and certainly the average age of death in developing countries is continuing to rise quite rapidly. Definitely they are catching up with the industrialized world. But in the industrialized world, we have not seen a complete leveling off of average longevity since World War II. It's continued to rise, albeit more slowly. And since we can't ascribe that to further progress against early life mortality, because that's gone away already, we have to look elsewhere. And sure enough, lower levels have been happening in terms of risk of death late in life. People have been more likely to survive from, let's say, their 68th birthday to their 69th birthday than they used to be. Now, of course, it's interesting to look at the reasons for that, and the reasons are a good deal less straightforward than they are in the case of the first wave of improvement in longevity. because basically what's happened is that we have been keeping people healthier late in life. But the way we've been doing it comes from a wide variety of sources. Some of them is a lifestyle, so less smoking, for example. Some of them are medical, like just better medical care, better ability for people to survive heart attacks and such like. But a lot of it is from a source that people who don't study aging often don't know about, which is that if you started your life, even prenatally, with suboptimal nutrition, then basically damage is done at the molecular and cellular level, which has no particular consequence for your health for a long, long time, but functionally it accelerates your biological age. So you're essentially spending the whole of your life biologically a bit older than you otherwise would be. So basically what's happened, what we believe is the major number one contributor to the change in life expectancy in the industrialized world between World War II and now, is basically that people who were 60 or 70 in World War II, in other words, born around the latter part of the 19th century, simply didn't have very good early life nutrition because they didn't have much prosperity. And as prosperity increased, early life nutrition also improved. So the people born in, let's say, the 1930s had a much better situation throughout their lives. And that translated into later age of onset of chronic progressive conditions. And, of course, that meant later death. Now, that, too, has now pretty much leveled off in many countries. In the US, in particular, we can see that it really has leveled off because it is being balanced, really, by a pro-aging problem, namely the obesity epidemic, which has been getting progressively worse. So people have more, type 2 diabetes and such like. And so we're seeing pretty much no increase in longevity anymore. And this is happening to a lesser, but nevertheless very clear extent in Western European countries. So really, we're not going to see another wave until we get a whole new class of medicine, rejuvenation medicine, which is, of course, what I work on.
So I guess one thing I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of the role of hygiene and kind of how that's impacted public health. And I think in certain ways, I mean, it's even a little bit tied to the current, global pandemic with COVID-19. And that said, it seems like especially like a lot of the practical things that at least the media and it seems like the CDC are telling people is, wash your hands and just being very hygienic, wiping things down after you use them, like, or whatever. If you're going to touch something after somebody else, wear gloves or things of that nature. What role does good hygiene actually play overall in, I guess, in a society's, longevity?
Well, these days, I think it plays a relatively minor role, except for right now in the COVID pandemic, of course, where we have an infection that's really nasty for older people especially, and where we really have to just slow down the rate of transmission. But the key thing that made the difference a century or more ago, a century and a half ago, I guess, really now, was the realization that hygiene was particularly important when you were actually in a medical situation. When you were a doctor or a nurse, washing your hands all the time and, using new instruments or disposable gloves or whatever, so as to make the risk of transmission of anything really minuscule, that made an enormous difference. Of course, this is no surprise because situations where people are doing surgery or whatever are precisely situations in which there's a high density of sick people, and therefore there's going to be a high rate of transmission if you don't take additional precautions.
Do you think that pandemics like these are going to become more commonplace as we go forward, let's say over the next, preceding few decades? I mean, do you think pandemics, equivalent to like the coronavirus we're going through right now, I mean, do you think these will be more common? And if they are, how can people be better prepared for them?
Yeah, that's the key question, of course, preparation. Because, of course, it depends what you mean by a pandemic. I mean, was SARS a pandemic? It kind of almost was, right? But, in fact, it was brought under control with the loss of a very, very much smaller number of lives, or indeed for that matter, a smaller number of dollars to the global economy. And the same with MERS, the same with avian flu. So we dodged a good few bullets over the past 50 years in terms of proto-pandemics, so to speak. And finally, this one's got us. Really, the only big thing that has made this pandemic into a bona fide world crisis is one feature of the infection that distinguishes it from the ones that went before, namely the latency, the time between when you catch the thing and become infectious to the time when you start exhibiting symptoms. It's only a few days. It's only maybe 5 or 6 days typically. But, if it were 2 days, we wouldn't be here. We would not have this pandemic because it would have been so much easier to close it down. And conversely, of course, we can totally imagine a scenario in which the next nasty infection that comes along has a longer latency period and it's even harder to close down. So, it's all about preparation. It's all about actually taking seriously the idea of prevention and protection and preemption and so on, so that we are ready next time. Number one, we're absolutely going to have a far more nimble system for developing vaccines and treatments for new infections. It is a complete scandal that it has taken so long to develop vaccines for COVID. But if you think about how things worked before, the speed at which these vaccines are being developed is far faster than what actually happened earlier. So I think we can be pretty optimistic that there will be a lot more preparedness in terms of the infrastructure, the response, and so on. Then, of course, there's quarantining and all the other, social distancing and limitations on behaviour that have been brought in. The world has been obviously making that up as it went along over the past 6 months, and we're a lot better at it now than we were 6 months ago. If we look at the situation in the US, or indeed pretty much everywhere in the world that's currently badly affected, and compare it to the situation in Western Europe, because Western Europe, really got the brunt of it after China itself, and we had very large numbers of infections per capita, and indeed large numbers of deaths, because we just didn't have any idea how to actually bring the social distancing situation in. And the US is doing really badly, no question about that. But it's doing a lot better than it would have done if it had been the first country to be hit back in March or April.
Today's episode is also brought to you by Writer Junkie. Are you thinking about starting a business or a side hustle? Writer Junkie offers website development, content writing, and SEO services for businesses. Call Writer Junkie today at 805-587-7966, and you can visit them online at writerjunkie.com. We'd also like to thank the Tax Defense Group for being a sponsor. In your experience, which country, in the world, I guess, would you say is at the forefront of medical science and, the creation of vaccines? And is there a country that really kind of blows everyone else out of the water? And I know for yourself, with your own background, you've obviously, you didn't grow up in the United States. You've worked in other countries. So I feel like you would probably have a better understanding than a lot of people that have primarily only lived in the United States.
Yeah, there's definitely not one country with any kind of monopoly on this kind of thing. We're seeing vaccines being developed in dozens of countries right now. And they're going to be, we have no idea which ones are going to work better. Probably different ones are going to work better for different populations. So this is how we need it to be. We need a wide variety of these things, and that is what's happening. In terms of medical research in general, that's the same. There's obviously a great deal done in the US. There's a big research budget, but there's plenty done elsewhere.
Well, that's definitely fair. Because I know that from the United States standpoint, I think in some of the ways that policymakers in the United States make it sound like is that, America has to be the country, or not necessarily has to be, but will be the country that develops the vaccine for this. And I have thought to myself, there are other countries in the world. If Japan created it, hey, that'd be great. That means less work we'd have to do if they created a vaccine that totally works. But I know that the United States, I don't know who's spending more money than other countries are on this, and who is mobilizing more of their, their resources to have it created. But I mean, obviously, the United States, I mean, it's such a big push here, but I imagine probably every country is in a similar boat.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I think we can certainly say at the moment that efforts to develop a vaccine are not being limited by funding, really. So, yeah, it's all happening. But, of course, what we really want to ask is what's going to happen next. Yeah. Once, as the pandemic becomes increasingly under control, we're going to be in a very different position, a position in which the world is trying to learn from its mistakes. And the question is, will it learn from its mistakes, and who will learn the most? So I'm focusing very strongly right now on trying to get people to understand that it will not be good enough to just focus on vaccine development. In fact, more than that, it would not even be good enough to focus on the aging of the immune system, which is, of course, very tempting to do because it's clear that COVID-19 affects the elderly particularly badly. I mean, every infection pretty much affects the elderly worse than it affects younger people, but the disparity in the case of COVID is particularly extreme. And when younger people are affected, it's because they have, accelerated development of the pre-existing conditions that are characteristic of aging. So that's good. People would say, let's rejuvenate the immune system to the elderly, and that would be wonderful if there were a lot more money put into that kind of research, both in the US and elsewhere. But that's not enough, because the thing about the aging of the immune system is that the aging of each of our systems, each of our organs and so on, is linked to the aging of the other ones. There's an enormous amount of crosstalk between these things, and therefore you cannot substantially rejuvenate one of them without rejuvenating all of them. So that's a message that is perhaps unwelcome to people with purse strings, but it has got to be communicated so that the correct decisions can be made in terms of what to prioritize so as to minimize the likelihood of the next pandemic.
Would you say right now, I mean, do you think that there's more resources available for the medical sciences than you've ever seen personally in your life before? Like, does it seem like there's just more funds and grants out there than ever before?
Yeah, well, not grants. I mean, maybe it's going up with the cost of living. It's going up pitifully. Government funding of research in general, and medical research is no exception. It's going up pitifully slowly, if it's going up at all, which is, pretty grim. And the only real, silver lining is that private sector investment in medical research is definitely moving up at a more rapid rate. And in particular in my work, the work in rejuvenation biotechnology and developing damage repair therapies that will make people biologically younger, this is a very new area. In terms of the private sector, it's extremely new. Really, there was no industry whatsoever 5 years ago, and now there's a really explosively burgeoning one. But yeah, I mean, that makes all the difference. I, as you know, am the chief scientist of a non-profit, Sense Research Foundation, based in Silicon Valley. And the reason we set ourselves up as a non-profit more than a decade ago was because, investors just couldn't be interested because the research was too early. There was too many steps to go and too much risk involved. But the steps that we have taken in that time have been sufficient to get at least some of the more courageous investors to be able to join the dots and feel that they can actually make money out of this in the long run. And so that's why money is there. And of course, investors are inclined to write much bigger checks than donors are. So that's all very well. Unfortunately, it's rather unevenly distributed right now. So Sense Research Foundation has definitely not got to a point where we can declare victory and leave it all to the private sector. We have to continue doing what we're doing and grinding away on the most difficult areas of damage repair, which are still not at the point of sufficient proof of concept for investors to take over.
So how long do you think this process will be before, I mean, when will, let's say, like the work that you're working on now, when will this for lack of a better term, kind of go downstream in the sense of your average or your, let's say, common person, like your average guy that's just, not a millionaire or anything like that. Like, how long until some of your treatments will be able to reach us, I guess, so to speak?
Right. So I'm very pleased to say that that's the wrong question.
Okay.
The reason it's the wrong question is because there will be a period before these therapies are ready for prime time at all. In other words, before they're available to anybody, even the wealthiest members of society. There will be a period when everybody knows that these therapies are coming. Remember, the reason why I spend my entire life on stage and on camera, and so do many of my colleagues, is that there is an insatiable public interest in this whole field. People are, they need to maintain some kind of emotional distance from the whole thing, I guess, but at the same time, they're fascinated by this, and they're desperate to have access to therapies that actually work against aging. Since the dawn of civilization, we've been trying to do this. And so, yes, so basically what's going to happen is that as time goes on and we edge inch by inch towards the development of these therapies, I and my colleagues will be out there on stage and on camera saying so. And, saying things in more optimistic language. Now, I've been saying things in optimistic language since forever, right? But my colleagues have more to lose by, being accused of saying things that are irresponsible, even if that accusation is unfair. They have been much more cautious, but they're getting less and less cautious. These days, I like to point out particularly what David Sinclair did last year. He's obviously another very prominent gerontologist, and he wrote a book whose title was Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. Now, he's a professor at Harvard, and I would claim that if he had written a book with that title 5 years previously, certainly 10 years previously, then he would have had to have a very, very uncomfortable conversation with his dean. Whereas now he can, right? I know I could write a book with that kind of title 15 years ago, but nobody else could. So as more and more of my colleagues started to come out of the woodwork and put their heads above the parapet, it's going to change the conversation in the wider world. People are going to start believing that this really is coming fairly soon, like probably in time for them, and that is going to cause them to vote for it, which is going to make a big difference. And it's also going to cause the decision makers and policy makers around the world who run the global economy to make decisions about the value of making sure that these therapies are actually available to everybody, irrespective of ability to pay. So that's the real distinction between this kind of medicine and the kind of medicines we have today for the health conditions of the elderly. When we have these medicines, they will pay for themselves. Today's medicines don't, because fundamentally they don't work. All they do is keep sick people alive a little bit longer, and they don't actually pay back. But if you've got medicines that actually prevent people from getting sick in the first place and keep them in a position so that they can continue to contribute wealth to society, those medicines will pay for themselves massively many times over, incredibly quickly. So even if one completely ignores the electoral imperative that I mentioned a moment ago, let alone the humanitarian imperative, the sheer mercenary economic imperative says that there will not be a delay. There will not be any period when access to these therapies is determined by ability to pay.
Wow. Well, that would certainly, I think every person alive should definitely be excited for that. Especially like what you're talking about too. Without necessarily putting a time frame on it exactly, but if a person is, 20 or 30 years old, it kind of sounds like from what you're saying that, they could certainly expect that these therapies will exist in their lifetime. If they live to be, well, let's say even, they're alive 50 years from now, they haven't died of, at a car accident or something like that. These therapies, it sounds like they'll be there and that they'll actually be able to make an impact on people's lives, on most people's lives. And that's definitely very exciting news.
Well, that's right. And this business about, being paid for by the taxpayer and so on, I know that it sounds very counterintuitive, especially into a US audience. Some people would say, oh, there's this naive British guy talking about big business will monopolize it and so on. But honestly, just go through the sheer, cold logic of what I just said. There is no way that will happen.
Yeah, and even right now, we've just seen in the United States, that the government spending is kind of, it just seems like it could be whatever they want it to be. I mean, we just saw them spend trillions of dollars on, this stimulus and this thing and that thing. So, I mean, I think something like this, I mean, I think it's more than worth it, even if it costs $500 billion a year for every resident of the United States to get this treatment, even if it was that expensive. I mean, I think that would be more than worth it.
Of course, yeah. I mean, not just from humanitarian perspective, but actually, that money would be paid back, would pay for itself incredibly quickly. We know that money is this kind of, strange commodity that doesn't really exist in the meaningful sense. When 12 years ago, of course, when we had the financial crisis, the money just was generated out of a hat. Levels of money that people didn't even know could exist.
Yeah, and then right now, I mean, this is like if in 2008, if it was, the government just pulled a rabbit out of a hat, right now it feels like they pulled a semi-truck out of a hat. It's so many trillions of dollars. I mean, the whole argument in the past was, oh, we don't have the money for this, we don't have the money for that. Well, it turns out we do have the money, kind of like what you were saying. They just make it appear. And I know there's probably going to be some, there'd be some fiscal responsibility type people there are some fiscal responsibility hawks that might say, well, we got to do this, we got to do that, and that means it's going to affect, inflation and this and that. But I don't know. I mean, it just seems like when they want to do something, they just do it, and it just happens. So I was going to ask real quick, how can, I probably asked this in the previous interviews too, but like, how can people, support you? Like, the guy that maybe, is not a super wealthy person, like what can the practical things that we can do to kind of support your work? And if we want to learn more about like the papers that you've published or any kind of news going on in your world, like where's the place that we can go for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, Sense.org, our website, is very much a repository of that information. We have a monthly newsletter, which you can sign up to. We also have, news all the time of what's happening, not just what we're doing, but what's happening in the rejuvenation world more generally. So absolutely, that's one thing to do. There's a variety of other blogs and newsletters around in this space now. In terms of what one can do with that information, well, of course, as you say, the main thing is to contribute financially to the research. And, of course, only a small number of people can contribute a lot of money. But what I always point out is that the less wealthy you are, the more people you know who are wealthier than you, which means that, of course, what everybody can do is advocacy. One can simply raise the quality of people's understanding of this and gradually grind away at the somewhat, willful ignorance that society has about this by way of putting it out of their minds and getting on with their miserably short lives and making the best of it, rather than having the courage to actually get involved in this crusade. Of course, people like you can do what you're doing right now. You can interview the right people and, get the word out. So yeah, everyone can do different things. If you're a budding scientist, you can study the right things, you can go into the right areas of research.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a very good point. I mean, just the idea of, just information getting out. Like, I feel like with the work that you're doing right now, I have a friend who, he passed away from liver cancer, and he was 45 years old. He passed away a week and a half ago. And I think about somebody like him, or even, the situation with Chadwick Boseman, the actor. I look at these guys and it's like, man, they're so young. I think Chadwick Boseman was 43. My friend was 45. And I just think to myself, like, man, like what, if it's possible to create therapies and practical medical science that could help people, just live longer lives and especially healthier lives. And if it can rejuvenate them so they're not constantly in chronic pain. That's the world I'd like to live in. So definitely. Well, thank you so much, Aubrey, for coming on again. I appreciate it. And the work that you're doing is it's great work. And I can't wait to actually do the therapies myself in my own life one day. So definitely thank you again, and I'll talk to you later.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care.